Welcome to the Why Gotta Why podcast. I am here. This is Peter Englert. I'm going to start calling Dave Bodie our virtual producer. He likes to bring in our virtual friends. Today, we have a pastor, but also a fellow podcaster by the name of Aaron Magnuson that is with us. He leads the Social Media Church podcast. And he's also a pastor just like me. And we're going to hear more about his role and where he serves. But he's from the Oregon area and now lives in the Los Angeles area. And so today we're going to continue our series about grief. And the question he's going to respond to is, why did I have to give up on my dream? So, Aaron, before I ask the question that I've asked all of our guests about grief, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do to keep busy in I always mess up San Diego and Los Angeles, but it's Cucamonga or did I get that?
Rancho Cucamonga. Yeah, it is an outskirts, it's east of LA. It's an outskirts of LA. Which is about, I still have not made it. I've lived here for 2 years and I haven't made it down to San Diego yet. But I need to. And I think we're about an hour and a half, 2 hours away from San Diego. So north of that. California geography for me growing up in Oregon was also like, I thought the Bay Area and LA were really close. In Northern California, it's so far away that people fly. If you live in Southern California, you don't drive to Northern California, you fly to Northern California. So I am learning lots about California geography as well, Peter, so don't feel bad about that. But I really appreciate you having me on. Everybody, my name is Aaron, and I am the online pastor at a church down here in California called One and All, and been doing that for a little over 2 years, and it's been great meeting people like Peter. Also having an opportunity to just kind of bless the greater church by working on cool things like the Social Media Church podcast, which is a podcast for church leaders all around the world who are trying to amplify their ministry online. And so that's how Peter and I got connected. And I have an interesting enough life, I guess, where Peter wanted to interview me. And we're talking about grief today, which I don't have a ton of experience with. But it's a really important topic. So I was intrigued to add to this conversation.
Well, and one of the reasons we asked you is I think sometimes when we talk about grief, we don't include super positive people. And as you can tell, Aaron's as energetic, maybe even more energetic than me. So let's, and I think the other cool thing about Aaron is we all deal with grief differently and we all have different levels of grief, but it's there. So Aaron, let's get started with this question. What's your basic understanding and definition of grief?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of an advantage to this. I don't have the perfect definition of it, but I studied human development and family sciences in school. I minored in sociology, took a lot of classes in psychology. I have a fascination and a love for humans. And so part of the courses did focus on processing grief and how we deal with it. And there is a healthy way to deal with it. And at some point, you have to deal with it. So whether you've chosen to deal with your grief, whether you recognize you have it or not, it is something that needs to be dealt with. And so I'm really glad that you're having a whole series talking about grief. Because frankly, I also think that it's something that the church doesn't necessarily talk about very well. And I think we're getting better at it as we recognize the importance of mental health. And just our health in general. And there's things that go on underneath the surface that the answer isn't just pray more. Jesus will heal you. Everything happens for a reason, so don't be sad. And so I really appreciate you talking about this. But my understanding of grief and maybe how I would talk about it would be it involves the loss of something. Whether that's life, whether that's like what we're going to talk about today, maybe your dreams. And for a lot of us actually have a really unique understanding of grief in this quarantine season. It's even the loss of a normal rhythm, a normal life. For a lot of high school students, it was the loss of their senior year. College students, I guess, as well. The loss of something that you have to walk down a process of to come out on the other side, basically having dealt with all of the emotions that come along with that loss. And to me, that whole entire process and that journey is grief.
So, I mean, our question today is why did I have to give up on my dream? So, What was your dream and what happened?
Yeah. So my dream, since I was very, very little, football, American football, not to be confused with football, if we have any global listeners, but American football was my dream. I loved watching it. I loved playing with it. I grew up in a family with one brother, and our dad was very into football. Never played, but was really into football, and so we would just always be in the backyard playing. And so it was just a huge part of my life, and ultimately what I started pursuing when I recognized that I had a place to go with football. And so probably starting, I mean, I started playing flag football in fifth grade, actually fourth grade. We couldn't have pads until we got into sixth grade, middle school, which was a really exciting time. And then probably about my junior year of high school, so played all of those years in between. Junior year of high school is when I really started getting serious about the pursuit of a scholarship at a Division I school. I guess I didn't necessarily have Division I in my head, but getting a scholarship to play football in college and seeing where that would go. And so I really pursued that heavily. So much so where that was probably my God. I grew up in a Christian household, and so I've known Jesus all of my life, but I never really owned Jesus as mine. It was my family's Savior. What we did on the weekends, I was fine with all of that, but he was always on the sideline while my pursuit of football was right in focus. And so didn't end up getting a scholarship, but I did get the opportunity to go to college at Oregon State University and play Division I college football. Was a preferred walk-on. For those of you that know what that means, is really a glorified way of saying I didn't have to try out to be on the team, but nobody was paying me to be on the team. So I was enrolled at Oregon State. I was essentially paying to be there to be able to get an education as well as play football. And I ended up doing that for 2 years. I redshirted my first year, so I was on a path for like a 5-year career, because I probably would not have been good enough to leave early, go to the NFL. I probably would have stayed at college, but I never stuck with it long enough to find out what the result would have been, because during my second year, or after my second year, between my second year and my third year, during spring practice, I really felt like God was calling me to leave, get a job so I could get money to marry, who's now my wife, and played volleyball at Oregon State. But I felt God was calling me to leave. So I quit, the first thing I've ever quit in my life. And I never thought that that would be the sport of football. But I stopped. I walked into the coach's office and said, "Hey, I'm going to stop playing. I feel like I need to be going in this direction." And so that was the end of that. So there was this whole years of my life that had been dedicated, really my whole life, in some way, shape, or form, dedicated to this idea of playing football, that ended in a very non-celebratory way. It's simply me walking into an office, letting my coaches know, taking stuff out of my locker room, and that was it. And just like that, years of my life that I had spent were gone.
So it's funny. I just saw something on Jerome Bettis, like, because he's a running back, he used to play for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had like the dream of like winning the Super Bowl and then retired. And so I guess what I'm curious with you is, I think a lot of our listeners, probably grew up in a sports culture. You weren't like a quarterback, you were an offensive lineman, which is like super specific. Like I look at that as being a catcher. And so I guess my question to you was, did you feel released, like, oh, this is a burden that I'm done with? Or did you feel when you left football, like, man, I invested so much to quit after two, like, or did you feel a little bit of both? Like, walk us through that.
Yeah. The quitting process is really interesting, and I don't have very many vivid emotions about it. But Peter, as you and I were having a previous conversation, there was kind of a recognition that I'd never thought about it in a way before, where I was going through a grieving process. And for some of our listeners here, you might be grieving something and you don't even know you're grieving it. And so I think there's value for anybody listening to this conversation to really reflect on maybe certain areas that aren't traditionally viewed as I was grieving that, or I am grieving that. But I realized with talking with Peter, I was like, yeah, there is a process that happened years down the road where I actually recognized how big of a loss that was. and ways that I was still processing it, even now today, where I'm almost a decade removed. Just actually this year it'll be a decade removed from playing the sport of football. But actually, in the moment, it was a very easy decision for me. And I think having a girlfriend, soon to be fiance, then to be wife, that you were very much in pursuit of, it kind of quickly replaced the loss and it backfilled it, I think, in a really healthy way. And at that point, I had really started owning Jesus for myself. I actually got baptized during that time. I'd never been baptized in my life before. And so there were some things that I think God graciously backfilled it with, which is why it probably took a while to identify it as grief. But there was about 100 guys in that locker room that I was doing life with daily. I mean, blood, sweat, and tears, everything, doing life with, that all of a sudden were just completely gone. And so I don't think I really paid as much attention to that as I could have or should have. But I do remember, Peter, in the moment, it was a lot tougher of a decision for the people who were around me. I remember getting asked a lot of questions like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I remember my mom telling me, Aaron, you can keep doing this. Like, we know that you're not like paying for your school right now. We know that you're not making money to pay for your school. We're happy. Like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. You're never going to get this again. And just the encouragement of sticking with it. And so it really seemed like it's something that my family and those close to me and around me were going to grieve more so than it just seemed like an easy decision to me. And I look back on that and I really know that that was the Spirit's leading, even if I didn't fully understand it the way I do today back then, which is also an interesting part of grief. As you're going through your process, sometimes you can look back and recognize what God has done with the losses in your life presently that might be really difficult to see in the moment, or if you're listening to this and you're currently grieving. But yeah, that's how I would answer it, Peter. I remember it being an easy decision. But now as I look back on it, there's things, and I know that we're going to get into this a little bit later in the conversation, where I'm asking the question, what if? And having dreams during the night of getting another chance to go back and finish the years of eligibility that I guess technically I still have left as an almost 30-year-old going back to college. I can't imagine doing that. But clearly there's something happening under the surface for me where I subconsciously, at least, still do think about that. And like, what would have happened if I stayed, and what would have happened if football had remained a part of my life in the way that it was then. But as far as in the moment, those are some of the thoughts that I was probably having.
Well, I actually want to go there now because you brought it up, but what are you grieving about that decision today that you weren't grieving years ago when you made it?
What I'm grieving today is the locker room and the relational aspect. And in a lot of ways, I've taken that grief to use it as an opportunity and use it as motivation to kind of rekindle or rejoin those relationships that I had in the locker room when I left. And I remember we talked about this, Peter, but when I left, I had seen some other players who had left the program, but they still kind of lingered around, like they were on the team and they were maybe even getting some of the perks of the team, but they weren't on the team anymore. And so I knew that when I wanted to leave, I wanted it to be a clean break. Just make it very clear that I didn't even go to a game to watch my friends. I didn't even go to a game that whole next year. I just didn't want to be around it. And not in any ill will type of way, but just to really like clearly state, like, I'm not lingering around. Like, I know the decision that I made and I'm committed to this decision that I made. But what I started realizing is I also forfeited all of the relational equity for a whole entire year that I had in that locker room with these guys that I naively thought I was playing football with, but really I was doing life with. Mm-hmm. And I think now, as an almost 30-year-old, when a lot of us kind of start to settle down, we have wives and husbands and spouses and kids, you start to settle down and you realize, wow, the most meaningful part of my experiences growing up were really the relationships, less about what we were doing and more about the people that I had an opportunity to interact with, share the gospel with, and impact. And so I think the biggest thing that I grieve today is knowing I could have done a better job of not losing the relational equity from the locker room.
What's really fascinating about that, and again, not that I was ever going to be a professional athlete. So like I started in like fifth grade and thought I'm going to go to UNC. And then
Yes.
like I was like, maybe I'll go to Arizona State. And then I thought I'll play basketball for Evangel. That's a college
Yes.
my brother went to. So, I slowly, and then I got to like sophomore year and I was like, I'm not playing the sport after high school. And
Right.
what I hear from you though is like, so when I grieve that, I think about, you know what, maybe I should have at least played at Valley Forge, played basketball. But what I hear from you is you don't grieve, at least you haven't shared primarily about not going to the NFL or not going to a bowl game or
Yeah.
something. You're like, I missed
Yeah.
an opportunity with friendship. Does that other part come in, or is that kind of the major thing with you? I mean, it's curious to me.
I do think there's an interesting, that's a really good question. As I'm thinking about, I think there's a uniqueness to the sport of football where every football player realizes this is something that I'm not going to ever do again, because you can't really play pickup football in the same way that you can play pickup basketball, volleyball. You can still be living in that delusion that sometimes I find myself in for years down the road, where it's like, yeah, I still got it. Just like I remember when I, had 30 points in high school, this one game, right? Like we played against so and so, they're in the NBA now, and basically could have done it if I didn't have that head injury or that ankle injury. There's a real sobering thing that football players understand, that when it's over, it's over. And you're not going back to this, and you're never going to dabble in it again, unless you're playing like flag football, which is all fundamentally just very different, which I've done, and all that's fun and great. But it's when you're walking away from the locker room, the pads and the helmet, you're not going to do that again.
Mm.
And so I think that you're always kind of thinking about that, and so you're kind of preemptively grieving what's to come, and already kind of dealing with some of the emotions about that. Now, as far as what could have been, I think God sobered my reality really quickly when I didn't get a scholarship to play, and there was grieving, and there was things that I had to go through. I still have the letter that my dad wrote me on signing day, when I fully expected to be signing somewhere, my letter of intent to go, and I didn't get to participate in that because I was only walking on. And so he wrote me a letter that day. I still have it. I look at it every signing day, which is coming up February 3rd. Yeah, so I think a lot of that grieving I went through, and God was gracious enough to slowly let me down and temper my expectations to where really the only thing that I have to grieve is, 3 more years of eligibility with my friends, with players. Yeah, there were some bowl games that they went to. I guess I didn't necessarily think about that as much, but it's mostly about 3 years of life experience that could have been had there with those guys that wasn't. And not only were those not there, there was even a year wasted where I wasn't doing anything relationally with them. I wasn't even reaching out via text. I wasn't calling them. I wasn't trying to hang out with them. And so, it would be more about that than the unrealistic expectation that Aaron Magnuson was going to go and become really good and play in the NFL.
Well, and I guess one of the reasons I want to ask that, because, when you think about a grief series with a podcast, we joke about there's an Enneagram 4, the individualist. They like love dark and deep emotions. Don't at me.
That's me.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, I am a 4. Yes.
Okay. So this makes it all the more like curious because I guess, so thank you for telling me that. So
yes.
Enneagram 4, individualist, okay with emotions and stuff like that.
That's me.
But so I guess my curiosity is, it sounds like you just went, and I think your words were, I had something to backfill it. Whereas I could imagine like, oh my goodness, I'm giving up football. And you're kind of saying you're feeling those feelings later. Because you brought it up, I mean, go ahead. Is that kind of the way it is right now, that as maybe in your moments that you're just kind of catching up, that you had something to replace it with, you've moved on, but also, you do have these emotions behind it.
Yeah. I do think that, really honing in on the 4 piece of it, we're very emotional creatures, and we ride a roller coaster of emotions. And so that can lead to a lot of optimism, because it's at some point going to be going up, and at some point it's going to be going down. But with the uniqueness of a 4, we also like to be down. Like there's a certain comfort that we feel in melancholy, and in this case, conversation, grief. I think we're comfortable talking about it, and we're comfortable existing in it. The key would be that you're also motivated to not stay in it. And so I think for me, the stuff that was backfilled was motivation to not stay in it. I think when I look back on it, yes, there are those feelings of grief, and there are those feelings of loss, but it's almost kind of like a romantic thought. Like there's like, yeah, I like to sit in that for a second. Like I enjoy reminiscing on the sadness of that. But God has also been gracious enough I've gotten a lot of those relationships back, and there are friends that I still have and I've been able to connect with now as we're all kind of getting families, settling down, everybody's kind of looking for that again. And so there are those opportunities to do that. And so I think God has really graciously helped lead me through a lot of what could be very tough moments in my life, understanding and being willing to engage with the emotions. I think that's the advantage that a 4 has in this grief is we're not going to run from those things, and we're not going to disengage from those conversations. We really like those conversations. And I also think that's why it allows me to talk a little bit more optimistically about it. And so I don't want that to be misleading, because I think everybody in every number on the Enneagram has to deal with these things in their own way. But I think what the 4 points out is that you must engage with it, and you must engage in this conversation, or else you're not going to make it on the other side of grief.
Well, and I want to hear the rest of your story, but I just want to bring this question up now. We've asked every guest some type of version of this question. Yeah. How do you know if you're positively grieving or negatively grieving? Like, what's the difference to you? What are some of the signs?
That is a great question. I really think not to pull out like a Jesus answer. I really think the people around you first and foremost are going to know, and I would say your probably spiritual habits, how often you're praying, how often you're in Scripture. Are you in community? Are you around people? And if you are around people, how would those people view what's going on? I think, and the Bible clearly lays this out, that there's things that are going on inside of us that come out, and it starts inside us and it works its way out. And it doesn't stay in there, it does work its way out. And so I think while you can't exclusively look at outward expressions, sometimes those outward expressions, especially for the people who are closest with us, our friends, our family, our spouses, our children, our parents, they will be able to know best, man, I think there's something going on. And so I would say, how willing, maybe it's as simple as how willing are you to engage in that conversation? How willing are you to look at the potential for grief, to talk about, and of course there's stages, right? But if you've been going 30 years or 10 years or even a year and you're just like, I'm not talking about that, that might be a posture or a sign that you're not grieving well. I think sadness or how much it still hurts would probably not be a good indicator. I think the better indicator is, are you willing to be engaged in the dialogue towards moving to the next stage of grief, or even grief, to where, and for some of us, it's getting counseling. My wife and I have done counseling, and the knowledge that counselors have and the tools that they pull out of the tool basket, I understood in those sessions, like, wow, this is why it's a profession. Like, you're a professional. There are things that you know about me and how to talk to me and help me that I don't know. And so I think being willing to talk about it, and and part of how that's helped is through our spiritual rhythms. Just your willingness to continue to do the tough work to get through it, I think, is how you're either doing it well, or if you're not doing those things, how you're doing it poorly, because that grief doesn't just heal itself and go away. Like, there has to be some intentional work through other people, through community, through conversations that help you get through that.
That's really good. We're going to come back to more of that conversation, but fill us in. What happened after college? It sounds like
Yeah.
you got married. Sounds like you got some kids. What? Where'd you end up, and how'd you end up in California?
We stayed in Oregon after we both graduated in 2013, got into ministry, which ultimately 5 years of being at that church in Oregon led to an opportunity to move down here to be an online pastor in Southern California. And God was gracious enough to bring us down to Southern California. My wife always wanted to live here, but we are very realistic about how much money you're making as a in the ministry, and didn't exactly know how God would do that or if he'd even fulfill a dream like that. And we still pinch ourselves every day that we're down here, just that God's called us down here, and seeing his hand and how he's utilized our obedience to benefit his kingdom has been really, really cool. But all of that life after, there are so many things that I have and decisions that I've made intentionally based off of the grieving process from being at Oregon State, particularly understanding the value of the relational aspect and the networking aspect of a locker room. I basically, Peter, treat every situation that I'm in and every seat that I get to sit in like another locker room. And I'm not going to treat that locker room the same way I treated my locker room at Oregon State, just understanding that there's people in here. There's an opportunity that I have that not everybody has, because I was one of 100 players. I think we had a few more players than that and coaches. And I got to be in there, and so many people didn't. I got to share this story. It always sticks with me. This is a good illustration of what I'm trying to articulate when I'm talking about the locker room. There was a mom and a son that it was just after practice, and our practices were open, so people were able to come and watch. And there was a mom and a son walking. And I just always remember this so vividly. I didn't know who they were. They were just walking. I was walking back from practice to our locker room to change, and they were kind of like looking behind a gate, and they were looking down on the field, just glancing at it as they were walking back to their car. And I was like, "Hey, you guys just want to follow me down and go onto the field just for a second?" And they were like, "Yeah, I don't know these people." And so, opened the gate, walked them down. They got to go on the field for a second and do all that. And then we said goodbye, and, they went off. I still don't know who these people are. The story sticks with me, though, because I invited them into a situation that they would not have otherwise been able to be invited into. And not because I was a starter. I never played it down. Like, I only practiced. I always joke that I was the third string water boy. The third string bench warmer is what I call myself. But because I was in the locker room, because I was on the team, it afforded me privileges that other people who might be really curious or interested about didn't get the opportunity to do. I used my resources that were a gift to me to benefit somebody else. And so that approach, that fundamental understanding is what I carry on. And it's part of how I think I deal with the loss of that situation, where I'm not going to ever do that again with whatever seat God allows me to sit in currently. And so right now, it's a seat in a large church that gives me an opportunity to help other churches and help other people who are trying to figure out what online ministry looks like, and being able to do that. And it's saying yes to as many things as I can: Zoom calls, conversations, being on people's podcasts, creating new friendships, because I don't ever want to squander the seat or the locker room that God's put me in.
Well, and one of the things I want to come back to is how hard, I mean, you grew up in Oregon your whole life, and it sounds like your wife really wanted to move to Los Angeles, and this, I mean, you had lunch with the pastor that would hire you. So
Right.
Is there any grief in the fact of, like, you left your hometown?
Mm.
It sounds, again, one of the reasons I love interviewing you about this is, you're very positive, and
Yeah.
even being an Enneagram 4, I understand it a little bit more. Like, you're
Sure.
very just open and talking about, hey, I felt this, I felt that. But,
Yeah.
I mean, is there any grief associated with that transition?
That's a good question. I think the short answer is no. And maybe this is a valuable principle as you're going through grief. What you're chasing, what is leading you when it's Jesus, when it's the Spirit, he's going to lead you out of that. And so God, in both of these scenarios, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, led me out of football, and he led me out of Oregon. Because I was very resistant to the idea, because we were living in Oregon. We were in my hometown. We were invested in the community. We had friends. We had so much support around us. God was doing incredible things in the church that we were at, through our ministry, through the ministry of the church in our city, just like things that had never happened before. Like God was so evidently moving. And I could never figure out why Megan, my wife, never really felt settled. It was always confusing to me, until God hit me over the head one day when we were having a conversation, because it was so evident. Megan and I would have these conversations. Again, having conversations, very important. And she would let me know, and we'd be wrestling through, and we were pregnant with our second kid. And so it was a great time again to talk about, hey, like, what does God have for us? And he just hit me over the head of like, Aaron, I don't need you here to keep doing these things. And don't you think I might have something else for you? Not better, but just something else for you. And so in both of those scenarios, what was leading me through the potential for grief, or even those situations that could be grieved, like leaving my hometown, like leaving the sport that I'd pursued my whole entire life, is that it was God and the Holy Spirit leading me through it. And I think that's really key as we talk about grief, is what ultimately is leading you through it. And that's why things like prayer and scripture are so important, because those are the ways that we really engage and follow and hear from the only person that can lead us out, which is Jesus. And it's the best person to lead us out, because that's what's leading us into the next thing that's ultimately going to put that grief to bed, give purpose and meaning to the pain, and see something beautiful come out on the other side.
Wow, that's really profound. And so where I want to kind of go with this is, you started at One and All Church as in-person community. Now you're full-time digital. There was a little bit of mix in that.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that a lot of our listeners have the same experience that I do, which is the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden everybody looked at the millennial and Gen Z in the room. And they're like, oh yeah, you were right about digital. And so there's this huge opportunity. But I'm curious, as you think about this question, why did I have to give up on my dreams and grief? Have you seen this season as an opportunity, but also what have you grieved in this past year that's been difficult for you? And I think you've talked a lot online about the angst of getting churches to kind of move to digital and things like that, but you've also seen some big wins and opportunities.
Yeah. So what have I grieved in this? Ask the question one more time, for my sake and for the listener's sake, and then I'll answer it.
Sure.
It's a good question. I just want to make sure I answer.
No, it's great. I think to kind of sum it up, what have you grieved this past year during the pandemic, but also you've seen kind of the opportunities? Because I think someone would look at you and say, Aaron, man, you were right about a lot of stuff. It just took a pandemic to prove it right. But what are you grieving too?
Yeah, that's a good call. I think that yes, all of us, if you're listening to this and you're having trouble identifying what you're grieving, I think you leveraging this pandemic as an opportunity to identify what grief feels like and even looks like is a great place to start. We all lost something, whether that's worst case, someone we loved to the coronavirus, or on a more lighter note, I can't go to my favorite restaurant anymore, and I'm probably seeing people less. We've all lost something. And so this pandemic has provided us a great opportunity to identify those things. And I think that's what I've loved most is, yes, there's been advancement in a space that I care about, that I'm professionally paid to do in my role here at One and All, where everybody understands, hey, we need to do stuff online, and online is viable because it's the only way we're getting through this pandemic communally. And so I think there's that. And I think I have a little bit easier time with this. And what I love even more than that is the idea of people having to deconstruct and just pause and take a moment to reflect on their lives. And for us as Christians, it's okay, I have a real opportunity now to hear from hear what God is saying, maybe what his direction is for my life. Maybe he's pointing things out to me that I've been neglecting for a while. The obvious things, right? Like, oh, I'm home with my wife now all the time, or I'm home with my husband. I'm home with my kids. Man, I was spending a lot of time at work, and there was all these other things over here. And so as we start to transition out of this, or whatever the world looks like after this, there's things that we're going to take with us that we were maybe taking for granted before or didn't recognize. And so it's this natural time of reflection, which of four loves. So for me, a lot of this pandemic has been very positive. And I realize that is a very small minority case. What I lost, though, is all of a sudden everybody became online pastors. And so the uniqueness of my role, something fours also love, no longer existed. And in a lot of ways, I've celebrated it. In some ways, I've had to grieve the loss of what my role used to be and look for what my role is now. And so God's had to lead me through that. That's been tough conversations. That's been internal frustrations. That's been, hey, everybody jumped into my pool. It's fun that we're all swimming together, but you're playing with all of my toys and you're not playing with them the way that you're supposed to be playing with them, right? That would be my analogy. And that was a lot of my experience the first part of the pandemic in 2020, probably for those first 6 months. And now God's kind of brought me to another spot that I can continue doing the ministry, continue helping our church, but it looks a little bit different. And so I think that's probably what I've lost. And I think him being gracious enough to backfill because he's leading me to a new spot. When we can understand that following Jesus is following him through grief, like keep following Jesus. I mean, that is applicable until your first breath to the last breath. He is going to lead you through grief. He's going to lead you through things. And you have to have an open hand and be excited when he puts something in and praise him when he takes something away, because there's something else that's coming back in. The key is just that, right, as Anna says from Frozen 2, right? I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. The next right thing. And the next right thing is to always be in step with where God is leading you.
Awesome. Hey, just 2 more questions and we'll close. You know, what would you say to a person that had to give up their dreams? How would you encourage them?
If you don't know Jesus, you need to know Jesus. And if you do know Jesus, he took that dream away from you, and he's going to give you a way to emotionally deal with it, and he's going to give you something else. Hopefully that you learn something from that dream, and that is going to benefit you in the next thing that he hands you.
That was good. Now, the way we close our podcast is we ask this question: what would Jesus say about giving up dreams? And so my role is I basically I'll say whatever comes to my mind, and then we rely on our guests to fix any heresy or wrong teaching. So that's the way we do it here. So
nice.
Listening to you, Aaron, it just gets me thinking. So when I came into this question, I thought about just the worst case. I gave up my dream, but I think what I'm leaving with you is there's opportunities on the other side. So I think about Jesus. He says, there's a guy that sells everything he has to buy a field to get the treasure. I think about the rich young ruler. There's this sense he's like, hey, if you give up on your dream of having all this money, you can follow me. And I want to be careful of that because there's a gospel implication, but there's also kind of just what you just said there. When we live life open-handed, it's amazing what God can do with that. And you can grieve it and walk through it, but you can
you should grieve it. Because it's a very real thing he took away from you, right?
Yeah.
And I want you to finish asking your question, but that you should grieve it. Like that, like it's being a Christian is not like, well, God took it, so I'm okay with it. I don't have to emotionally, we are spiritual beings with a fleshly body, right? And so the flesh forces us to do things we wouldn't otherwise have to do. And when we go to heaven, praise God, we're not going to have to do. You should grieve it because there's you cared about it and God gave it to you because you cared about it. But you can't care about it forever at the expense of where God is leading you. But yeah, so I just want to be clear, like you can't, like as the church, it's not just you need more Jesus and you don't feel bad. That is the worst theology. That's the heresy. If there's a heresy from today, it's that you don't need to feel bad when God takes things away from you. You can feel bad, but you have to work through it because something else is coming, because our role in following God and his impact on our lives and the impact our lives are going to have on others never stops. But finish asking your question.
No, I did. Well, I was responding to the question first, and then you get to close us up. So, what does Jesus say about giving up dreams? Anything that was maybe left unsaid? So
yeah, two things come to mind specifically pertaining to that question. The first is something our pastor Jeff Vines says out here all the time. Jeff says, and really his ministry kind of focus is built on this principle of giving up something you love for something you love even more. And when we play that game all the way to the top, it should end with Jesus, and Jesus will never ask us to give up him, and you can't lose him. So the guiding principle of following Jesus, following his spirit through these grieving times, it will take you through anything, because that is the ultimate. That's the trump card. That's what's never going to leave. Your dream of loving and following Jesus will always be your dream. So giving up something you love for something you love more, when we have that mindset, we hold our dreams a little bit more loosely, but we also understand we can still love that thing. I still love my spouse. I still love my kids. At that period of my life, I loved football. But God may ask us at any time to give up that thing that we love for something we love even more. And that will always end in, well, is your foundation built on loving Jesus and your ultimate pursuit, everything you're doing in life built around that? I should probably end on that, but I also wanted to say, so the idea of giving up something you love for something you love even more. What would Jesus say about giving up dreams? I think a more practical approach to that, though, because I think that's great, like great in principle. But for those people who are still hurting in grieving, I would say what I've learned in the dreams that I've had to give up is all of those dreams stack, like you learn stuff, and those stack on top of each other to ultimately benefit the next thing that's placed in front of you. All the way to, some people describe it as like the pinnacle of their ministry. Everything I did was for this moment right here. And we can experience that in business. We can experience that in parenting. For those of us who are actually in vocational ministry, we can experience that. And so understand that you're really grateful for the dream that you have right now and pursue it with everything you have, but also understand that that might not be the pinnacle, but it doesn't mean it's worthless or not worth pursuing. It means that there's something to be squeezed, extracted, gained from that dream that's going to ultimately benefit the next dream and the next dream after that and the next dream after that. So be simultaneously excited about what you have today, grieve what you had yesterday, and be excited about what you're going to have tomorrow.
Man, that's an awesome place to end. Make sure you follow Aaron online, Aaron Magnuson 79 on Twitter and Instagram. You can also follow him on the Social Media Church podcast. Is there anything I'm missing, Aaron, to kind of, if people want to get a hold of you?
No, Instagram and Twitter are the best two ways to get a hold of me. But yeah, just love the opportunity to connect with new people, meet new people. Reach out like Peter did. Just send Twitter direct messages. That's ultimately how I ended up my job here in California. Now it's more Instagram direct messages because that was quite a few years ago. But yeah, reach out if you have anything. Those are the best places to reach me. Yeah, if you want to listen to a podcast, Social Media Church podcast is the way to go. oneandall.church. oneandall.church is my church if you want to check that out. But yeah, thanks for having me, Peter.
Yeah, and if you send a pigeon letter, it'll probably take 6 months. Anyways.
And you might not get anything back either. But anyways.
We'll open that topic later. But you can make sure you rate and share our episode. You can use hashtag WGW podcast. That's also our handles for Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And then most of all, you can go to whygodwhypodcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us today.